Thank you. What a pleasure to be with you. And what I want to discuss with you today, a question I want to explore with you, is what is the need of the hour? What is the need of the hour? That's an interesting question because I think it depends on who you are and where you are. If you're a homeless person, especially in these sub-zero conditions, the need of the hour is some shelter. If you're an extreme medical patient, emergency medical patient, then the need of the hour would be a fast ambulance, the right medication, a good doctor who can give you timely advice, not like the doctor who called up his patient and said, I've got good news for you and I've got bad news for you. Which one do you want to hear first? And the patient said, well, give me the good news. And the doctor said, well, you've got 24 hours to live. And the patient said, what? That's the good news? What's the bad news? And the doctor said, well, I tried to get hold of you yesterday. Now, hopefully, in the need of the hour, when you're in that emergency environment, you'll get a bit better doctor than that. What is the need of the hour in the marketplace? If you ask some business people, they will say it's capital. I need access to capital. Other people will say, the need of the hour is good people. I need to be able to select talent. Others will say the need of the hour is good technology, up-to-date technology. That's the need of the hour. Let me tell you what I think the need of the hour is. The need of the hour is great leadership. The need of the hour is men and women, an army of men and women who understand, exercise, and teach great leadership. That's the need of the hour. And it's really the answer to the need of the hour, because every other need that we may have identified will be answered by that one need. So that is the need of the hour. And I am very excited about sharing this with you because you are people who influence leaders in the marketplace. So think of this as an invitation to join me in shaping and influencing the way leadership is exercised and viewed during the next decade. And that's quite a challenge, isn't it? Because we live in extraordinarily complex times. Yeah, the army, the military has a term for it. They call it a VUCA world. Doesn't that have a good sound to it? A VUCA world. It's just fun saying it. What does VUCA stand for? It means volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. That's the kind of world that leaders are leading in. And the conditions under which they're leading are immensely difficult, much more than they have been. And that's not just the gripe of one generation complaining about how much worse it is in this generation compared to others. It is genuinely more complex. The expectations have never been as high. The scope has never been as broad. The scrutiny has never been as intense. The structures of organizations have never been as complex. And the rate of innovation has never been as rapid as it is now. Think about this. Between 1900 and 1950, the sum total of technological information doubled once. So whatever it was in 1900, it was twice that in 1950. In the next 50 years, it doubled 10 times. Now that doesn't mean it was 10 times greater. It went 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. That means that in that 50 years, it was 1,024 times greater in 2000 than it was in 1950. It was doubling by the end of this last century at a rate of every 2.5 years. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that by 2012, it will double every 72 hours. Can you imagine that? Isn't that a complex world? If that doesn't describe a VUCA world, I don't know what does. And you think of the impact that that has on leadership. Leadership itself has become much more complex. I counted up the different disciplines there were in leadership. And if you think about the different disciplines, you've got emotional intelligence, you've got business process reengineering, you've got systems thinking, you've got situational leadership. There are at least 30, if not more, disciplines that are recognized as leadership disciplines. If you're helping a leader to grow as a leader, where do you start? Where does he or she start? If you as a leader want to grow, where do you start? No wonder it's confusing and complex. You know, when I was looking for a publisher for this book, Great Leadership, a few years ago, I went to Amazon to find out how many books, titles there were that had the word leadership in the title. Can you take a guess how many there were? Just take a stab at it. How many?
200,000.
200,000. That's probably a little high. but it was, well, the number was 64,000 and some change. That is huge, isn't it? Now, when I saw that, it told me two things. The first thing is that there's a huge hunger for information on leadership. I mean, that tells you something. People want that kind of information. And there's also a lot of confusion around leadership. That's the second thing that it told me. Especially when you consider that most leaders in the marketplace operate from two things. They operate from intuition and experience. And in this kind of environment, with the complexity that we're living in, intuition will fail us at some point, and an experience will be inadequate. So it's not going to work. And what we see is leaders in the marketplace who really have kind of lost their sense of direction. Even the good ones are not really that clear about what direction they're going in and what kind of leaders that they need to be. It's kind of a little bit like those two soldiers, British soldiers during Desert Storm, and they got lost in one of these engagements, a lot of dust and a lot of smoke, and they got completely disoriented. And so they kind of was staggering around and literally bumped into a US Army general. And one of them blurted out and said, "Where are we?" And the general, who was a little bit taken aback by this evident lack of respect for his rank, he said, "Do you know who I am?" And one of the soldiers turned to the other and said, "We're in a real mess now. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is." Doesn't it feel like for some leaders that they don't know where they are and they don't know who they are? So back in the early 90s, I was looking for, and this is what eventually led to the book, I was looking for how do you create something that will really help leaders make sense of this enormous complexity. And so that's when I began to think, well, what they need is a framework. And by the way, when I pitched this to the publisher, I told them that this is the book that will explain the 64,000 other books that are out there on the market. And evidently he bought it. He bought the argument. That's what leaders need. They need a framework. So what I want to do very briefly is just describe to you what that framework looks like. Because it's got to be adequate to embrace every single discipline of leadership that's out there. Einstein once said that everything should be as simple as possible and no simpler. And that's the problem with leadership. We've either made it so complicated that it's no use to us, or it's so simple we can't use it. It's ineffective. So we need it to be as simple as possible and no simpler. In fact, my original title for the book was Reducing Leadership to a Manageable Complexity. And he obviously figured out that that was not going to sell. In its raw essence, leadership is about character and competence. Those two concepts embrace every single element of leadership. And you've got to have both. If you have one without the other, you don't have great leadership. It's like two wings of an aircraft. You need both. You've got to have both. And if you don't have one without the other, you don't have great leadership. So what does that mean? What does character mean? Well, the way I define character is pursuing noble ends with noble means. That's, to me, a good definition of character and leadership. And you cannot have one without the other. For this, you need both too, because you can pursue a noble end, but if you're not pursuing it with noble means, the end may be good, but it's not great leadership, because you need to apply noble means to it. What about competence in leadership? Competence in leadership is applying knowledge, skill, and talent to the noble ends and the noble means. Knowledge, skill, and talents, you've got to know what great leadership is. You've got to be able to practice it and develop it. I think it was Vince Lombardi who said, it isn't practice that makes perfect, it's perfect practice that makes perfect. So you've got to have the right knowledge so you can develop the right skills and then develop the talent. And everyone, I believe, has talent in leadership in some context. And what we need to do is we're developing other leaders is help them figure out what that context is so that their talent then can really grow and grow and develop. So that's what competence in leadership is. And competence in leadership really has 3 dimensions to it. There's what I call organizational leadership, that's leading the organization. Then there's operational leadership, that's leading all the operations and tasks within the organization. And then there's people leadership. And there's a lot of confusion around this because they each have very distinct skill sets. Think of it as a ship. You've got the captain on the bridge of the ship. Where's his focus? It's outward, isn't it? It's outside. He's concerned about making sure that the ship doesn't hit any icebergs or any other ship, doesn't run aground, and it gets to the port of destination. Now, the ship has to run. So that's organizational leadership, leading out. But the operations within the organization still need to be led. And that means that the cooks have to be good at cooking so they can feed the crew. The place has to be maintained. The engines have to be maintained and serviced. All that is the operations within the organization. And then you've got the people, from the captain to the guys scrubbing the decks. The purpose of people leadership is to bring out the best in their people. Each one of those has a very distinct skill set. And great leadership, in terms of competence, understands how those 3 apply to any given leadership role. Let me just address briefly the character side, and I'll wrap up with this. Because character is the pursuit of noble ends with noble means. And I've developed sort of a pyramid, and I'll kind of describe it briefly to you. On the foundation, the character rests on 3 things. One is self-awareness. Great leaders have huge amounts of self-awareness. They know their own strengths and weaknesses. They know what their aspirations are. And they also have a sense of what their own worldview is, what their own philosophy of leadership is. And then they also have a very clear moral compass. That's sort of part of the foundation. And on top of that, you can then build what is the essence of character. And I think of 3 core building blocks. One is humility. And that is you put the interests of the organization and the people who are working with you and for you ahead of your own. That's humility. That's how Jim Collins described it. And he also identified another one, which is focus, having a very clear sense of focus and direction. The one that Jim Collins didn't address was care for others. And that's a huge piece. And that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily be friendly, but you do really have to care about them. Sherman during the Civil War was one of the hardest generals to serve under. But his soldiers loved him because they knew that he cared about what was important to them. What was important to them? Their survival. So when he told them to march 14 hours to go and fight a Confederate force, they didn't bat an eyelid. They went because they knew he cared about what was important to them. And then the thing that holds it all together to me is the glue is communication and humor. And humor has a very powerful effect of defusing situations. You know, Reagan was a master at it. You know, when he got shot and he was lying at the surgery table, and he looked up at these doctors and he said, "Boy, I sure hope you all are Republicans." And Churchill was another one, and we remember these leaders because of their humor. Churchill was once in Canada during the war trying to drum up some business, some support for the war, and he was invited to a luncheon. A big luncheon was held for him in this city. And so they had all the dignitaries on a podium at the front and this a table, and they were all sort of sitting facing everyone else. And they asked him if he wanted to have some whiskey. Now, they knew that he liked whiskey, but he didn't normally drink it at lunch. He started typically at 5 o'clock, and at that point, he would take it very seriously. But at this point, normally at lunch, he didn't. But on this occasion, he said, "Yes, I think I will." And because he had accepted it, everyone else was asked, and so they all felt obligated to accept too. And it went all the way down the line, and then there was a bishop at the far end of the table who stood up in full height and said, "I would rather commit adultery than drink whiskey." Now, by that time, the young lady who was serving them was just retreating into the kitchen area, and Churchill called back and he said, come back, come back. I didn't know there was a choice. Isn't that great? That ability to diffuse a really tense situation with humor. That's a great quality as a leader, isn't it? The final one I want to touch on is courage. And I think this, to me, as I get older, I think this is the one that I think is really, really critical in the marketplace. Because I've worked with companies and clients where they've been through a process of defining their direction, but it does require making some hard choices. And sometimes they make them and sometimes they don't. And when they do, it's good, and when they don't, it's at the heart of it is a lack of courage. My father was in the British diplomatic service, and when I was a young kid, we were in Saudi Arabia, and it was a time of very tense relations between the Arab world and the West. And so they closed down all the embassies and expelled all the diplomats. And my parents, my mother and I actually went back to England, spent 6 months there while they closed the embassy. It took 10 days. If you can imagine this, 10 days to burn all the papers. They didn't have shredders at that time. And you can't burn a stack of papers. So it just took them forever. They had 10 days to get out. Well, my mother and I then spent 6 months, and we traveled around and visited friends and family. And on one trip, I remember this very vividly, we turned on the radio and we tuned in to a BBC radio play. And it was about four climbers who got stuck in a blizzard climbing in the Alps. And they managed to pitch this tent, but the blizzard just didn't let up. So here they were, the four of them, knee to knee, face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and hoping for it to change, but it wasn't changing. And as it got just worse and worse, they began to open up to each other. And one of them shared how his marriage really wasn't that good and how disappointing it was. And then one of them said this, you know, I always wanted to emigrate to New Zealand, but I never had the guts to do it. And the other said, what do you mean you didn't have the guts to do it? You're the most courageous climber of us all. And he was the best and the most courageous climber. And he silenced them and he said, there's long-term guts and there's short-term guts. I've got short-term guts. Ladies and gentlemen, I would say that what the need of the hour is men and women who understand exercise and teach great leadership, and that we exercise long-term guts in the pursuit of that. I want to ask you to join me in the pursuit of that over the next decade as we change the way leadership is exercised. Thank you very much.